just 10 minutes to grab gas from a rundown station in the Appalachian foothills. When she returned, her world shattered. The kids were gone, the truck untouched. Alara was paralyzed with horror. For years, the case went cold, her desperate search yielding nothing but grief. Now, the police have uncovered new clues, but is it enough to bring them home? Alara Voss gripped the worn steering wheel of her old pickup truck, the engine sputtering as it climbed the last incline into the shadowed folds of the Appalachian foothills. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth, a familiar perfume that had once soothed her during these family outings. Today, though, it carried an undercurrent of unease, like the forest itself was holding its breath. She glanced in the rearview mirror at her two children, Lila, 8, with her freckled nose buried in a dog-eared book of fairy tales, and little Theo, 5, kicking his sneakers against the seat in rhythmic impatience. "Almost there, kiddos," she called back, her voice laced with the forced cheer of a mother juggling too much. The gas gauge hovered perilously close to empty, but the old map promised a station just ahead, tucked into the hollow where the road met the edge of the national forest. That was 3 years ago, a memory that now clawed at Alara's mind like thorns in the underbrush. She stood in her cramped kitchen in the remote hamlet of Hollow Ridge, West Virginia, the kind of place where cell service was a rumor and neighbors were separated by miles of twisting gravel roads. The community was a patchwork of weathered farmhouses and tight-knit families bound by a shared faith in the old ways. Baptist hymns on Sundays, potlucks that masked deeper resentments, and a stubborn resilience against the outside world's intrusions. Alara poured herself a mug of black coffee, the steam rising like ghosts from the past. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the chill seeping through the drafty windows, but from the letter she'd found that morning, nailed to the post of her mailbox like a crucifixion. The envelope was plain, unmarked save for the faint smudge of grease on one corner. A mechanic's touch, perhaps. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore typed words that sent ice through her veins. They didn't suffer. Not like you will if you keep digging. No signature, no postmark, just the threat, hanging in the air like the pungent odor of motor oil that clung to the paper. Alara's breath caught, transporting her back to that fateful day. The truck had coughed its last just shy of the gas station, the needle dipping into red as if mocking her oversight. "Stay put, loves," she'd said, locking the doors with a reassuring click. "Mommy's just going to grab a can of gas. Be right back." Lila had nodded solemnly, clutching Theo's hand, their faces pressed against the window as she trudged the quarter-mile down the road. The station was a relic, its pumps rusted and the attendant, a grizzled man named Harlan with a perpetual squint, grumbling about the price of fuel. She'd bought the gas can, filled it, and hurried back, the sloshing liquid a comforting weight in her hand. But as she approached the truck, parked in the pull-off amid the encroaching trees, her world shattered. The doors were still locked, the windows intact, but the seats were empty. No signs of struggle, no broken glass. Just gone. Lila and Theo vanished into the thin mountain air. The initial search had been frantic. Local deputies combing the woods with hounds that bayed into the night. Volunteers from Hollow Ridge forming chains through the undergrowth, their lanterns flickering like fireflies. Alara had screamed their names until her throat was raw, her faith, a bedrock inherited from her late parents, cracking under the weight of unanswered prayers. "Why would God let this happen?" she'd whispered to the pastor, who offered platitudes about divine plans and a valley of shadows. But as days turned to weeks, the leads dried up. The truck was impounded, dusted for prints that yielded nothing but her own and the kids'. The case went cold, filed under possible runaway or tragic accident, though Alara knew better. Someone had taken them. Someone who knew how to unlock a door without force, who had watched and waited. Now, 3 years later, that letter reignited the embers. Alara set the mug down with a clatter, her mind racing. She wasn't the same woman anymore. Grief had forged her into something sharper, more tenacious. Once a quiet homemaker relying on her husband's income from the coal mines, she'd buried him too, lost to a cave-in just months before the disappearance. Left alone, she'd taken odd jobs cleaning houses in the valley, her resourcefulness blooming from necessity. But vulnerabilities lingered. The community's whispers that she'd been negligent, the self-doubt that gnawed at her in the quiet hours, questioning if her distraction that day, rushing to escape the stifling isolation of Hollow Ridge for a picnic in the woods, had invited this horror. And her faith? It wavered, a flicker against the encroaching dark, pitting divine justice against the primal urge to hunt down the truth herself. She needed help. Dialing the number she'd memorized long ago, Alara waited as the line crackled. "Detective Russo," came the gruff voice on the other end. Marco Russo, the lead investigator on the case, a burly man in his 50s with a Brooklyn accent that stuck out like a sore thumb in these hills. He'd relocated to West Virginia after a botched case back east, a child abduction that ended in tragedy, haunting him like a shadow. Alara had seen it in his eyes during those early interrogations. A personal stake, a drive to redeem himself. "It's Alara Voss," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I got something. A letter. Threatening." Russo's sigh was audible, heavy with the weight of unsolved files. "Bring it in." "But Alara, we've been over this. No prints, no witnesses. The gas station camera was busted that day. Harlan said it had been out for weeks." She knew the details by heart. Harlan, the attendant, had alibied out, claiming he'd been inside the whole time. No other customers. The forest road was desolate, rarely traveled except by locals. But something nagged at her. The faint whiff of oil on the letter, reminiscent of the station's grease pits. Could Harlan be involved? Or someone else, bitter from the mine's closures, resenting families like hers who clung to the land? Driving to the sheriff's office in the county seat, a 30-mile trek over winding roads where the crunch of gravel under tires echoed like accusations, Alara replayed the day in her mind. The kids' laughter, Theo's sticky fingers from a candy bar, Lila's innocent questions about the stars they'd see that night. The truck, an old Ford with a temperamental lock that sometimes stuck. Had she really secured it? Doubt crept in, but she shoved it aside. This letter proved it. Foul play, not accident. Someone knew details only the abductor would. At the office, a squat building flanked by overgrown weeds, Russo met her in the lobby. His face was lined deeper than she remembered, his tie askew. He took the letter gingerly, slipping it into an evidence bag. "We'll dust it for prints, run it through the lab." But Alara, threats like this could be a crank. Kids go missing in these parts, hikers, runaways. Doesn't mean. "It's him," she interrupted, her eyes fierce. "The one who took them. Smell it, the oil. Like the station." Russo's grim nod confirmed her fears, though he masked it with professional detachment. He promised to revisit the site, maybe canvass Harlan again. But as they spoke, a deputy interrupted with a file, an old report from a nearby town, a similar incident years back. A family stalled on the road, children gone while the parents sought help. Unsolved, chalked up to wanderers. A pattern? Alara left the office with a fragile hope, the letter's words searing her thoughts. Driving back, the foothills loomed like silent sentinels, their isolation a double-edged sword, peaceful, yet hiding dangers in the hollows. The community would resist digging up old wounds. Elders like Pastor Green urged acceptance. Faith in gods will over earthly justice. But Alara couldn't. Not with this clue, this taunt. As she pulled into her driveway, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows over the fields, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered, heart pounding. Static crackled, then a distorted voice. "You should have left them alone." The line went dead. Alara stared at the phone, the chill of isolation wrapping around her like fog. If the truck was there, untouched, how had they vanished? And who was watching her now? What really happened that day? Alara Voss stood outside her weathered farmhouse, the Appalachian dusk settling over Hollow Ridge like a heavy quilt. The air carried the faint tang of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, mingling with the memory of that grease-stained letter, its oily scent still clinging to her fingers. She'd barely slept since the threatening call last night, the distorted voice looping in her mind. You should have left them alone. Her resolve hardened, a steel forged from 3 years of grief and defiance. But the community's eyes weighed on her. Hollow Ridge was a place where secrets were buried deep, like roots under the rocky soil, and her insistence on digging threatened to unearth more than answers. The morning after delivering the letter to Detective Russo, Alara drove to the sheriff's office again, the gravel crunching under her tires like the snapping of brittle bones. She'd spent the night poring over old photos of Lila and Theo, their faces frozen in time. Lila's crooked smile, Theo's messy curls. The images fueled her, but so did the doubt gnawing at her core. Had she missed something that day at the gas station? Had her distraction, checking her phone for a signal, worrying about the picnic, given someone an opening? Her faith, once a comfort, felt like a fraying thread, tangled with questions of why God hadn't protected her children. Justice, not prayer, was her anchor now. At the sheriff's office, Russo met her with a cup of stale coffee and a grim expression. The letter had yielded no prints, just as she'd feared, but the lab confirmed the grease was motor oil, common to any mechanic's shop or gas station. Harlan's place is the closest match, Russo admitted, rubbing his stubble jaw. But he's been cooperative. No record, no motive. We'll talk to him again. Alara nodded, her mind flashing to Harlan's squinting eyes, his slow drawl when she'd bought the gas can 3 years ago. He'd seemed harmless, a fixture of the hollow like the rusted pumps outside his station. But that oil, it was a thread, thin but tangible. Russo shared another lead, the old case file from the nearby town of Blackthorn, where 2 siblings had vanished a decade ago under eerily similar circumstances. Their parents had broken down on a forest road, left the kids in the car to fetch help, and returned to find them gone. No trace, no ransom. The case had haunted Russo, a reminder of his failure in Brooklyn. I'm not saying it's connected, he cautioned, but the pattern's there. We're pulling records, looking for overlaps, locals, drifters, anyone with a grudge. Alara's pulse quickened. A grudge. Hollow Ridge was full of them. Families displaced by the coal mine closures, resentments simmering against those, like her late husband, who'd worked the last shifts before the layoffs. Back in Hollow Ridge, Alara faced a different battle. The community gathered at the church for the weekly potluck, a ritual of casseroles and strained smiles. Pastor Green, his voice soft as worn flannel, pulled her aside. Alara, you're stirring pain we've all tried to heal. Trust in God's plan. Your babies, they're in his hands. His words, meant to comfort, felt like a slap. The other women, matrons like Mrs. Callie, whose son had left for the city and never returned, whispered as Alara passed, their eyes accusing her of defying the town's unspoken rule. Let the past lie. She wanted to scream that her children weren't gone, not in her heart, not while that letter proved someone knew more. But she held her tongue, her tenacity clashing with the isolation of being an outsider in her own home. Determined, Alara drove to Harlan's gas station, a squat building dwarfed by the towering pines. The pumps stood like sentinels, their paint peeling under years of neglect. Inside, Harlan leaned on the counter, wiping his hands on a rag that reeked of oil. Heard you're asking questions again, he said, his squint narrowing. Ain't nothing new to tell, Mrs. Voss. I was here, ringing up that gas for you. Didn't see a soul. His tone was flat, but Alara caught a flicker in his eyes. Nervousness? Guilt? She pressed him about the station's busted camera, the one Russo said hadn't worked in weeks. Harlan shrugged. Old tech. Breaks down. Ain't got the cash to fix it. As she left, Ilara noticed something. A faint repair mark on the station's doorframe. A welded brace that looked newer than the rest of the rusted structure. It was subtle, but the metal gleamed, out of place in the decay. Her mind snagged on it, a sensory clue that echoed the oil on the letter. Someone had fixed this door, someone with skill. Harlan? Or another shadow lurking in the hollow? That evening, Ilara met Russo at the old pull-off where her truck had stalled 3 years ago. The forest loomed, its silence mocking her grief. Russo had brought a forensic tech to re-examine the site, but the ground, now overgrown with brambles, offered no new clues. "We're chasing ghosts," Russo muttered, but Ilara caught his glance toward the gas station, visible through the trees. "I'm not giving up," she said, her voice sharp. "That letter means someone's scared. They're watching." Russo's grim nod confirmed her fears, but he warned her to stay cautious. "Whoever wrote that knows you're pushing. Don't make yourself a target." Back home, Ilara's resolve wavered under the weight of exhaustion. She sat at her kitchen table. The letter's words burned into her mind. The community's resistance, Harlan's evasiveness, the old Blackthorn case. It all pointed to a truth buried deeper than the coal seams beneath these hills. She traced the edges of a photo of Lila and Theo, their faces lit by a campfire's glow, and whispered a promise. "I'm coming for you." As she locked the doors for the night, a noise startled her, a sharp thwack against the porch. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. There, nailed to the post where the mailbox stood, was a new envelope, its edges stained with that same oily sheen. Inside, a single line, "You're closer than you think." Stop now. Who was watching her? Ilara Voss stood frozen on her porch, the new envelope clutched in her hand, its oily stains smearing under her thumb. The Appalachian night pressed in, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and the distant howl of a coyote, a sound that felt like a warning. The words inside, "You're closer than you think." Stop now, Dot, burned through her exhaustion, igniting a mix of fear and defiance. Whoever was behind this knew her every move, watching from the shadows of Hollow Ridge's tangled hills. Her faith, already battered, wavered further. No prayer could silence the primal urge to protect her children, Lila and Theo, stolen 3 years ago from a locked truck on a desolate forest road. She shoved the envelope into her pocket, her resolve hardening like the frost on the ground. She was done waiting for answers. The next morning, Ilara drove to the sheriff's office, the gravel road crunching under her tires like a heartbeat. Detective Russo met her in the parking lot, his face etched with fatigue, his tie as crooked as ever. "Another one?" he asked, eyeing the envelope she handed over. His voice carried the weight of too many dead ends, but Ilara caught a flicker of urgency in his eyes, a reflection of his own ghost from that failed Brooklyn case. "Same oil," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Same threat. It's not a prank, Marco. They're scared I'm getting close." Russo nodded, slipping the envelope into an evidence bag. "We'll analyze it, but Ilara, you're poking a hornet's nest. Stay low." The lab results wouldn't come for days, so Ilara took matters into her own hands. She returned to Harlan's gas station, the rusted pumps looming like skeletal relics against the dawn. The welded brace on the doorframe still nagged at her, a repair too precise for the station's decay. Inside, Harlan was wiping down the counter, his rag leaving streaks of grease that matched the envelope's stains. "Back again, Mrs. Voss," he drawled, his squint sharper today. "Told you, I got nothing new." Ilara pressed him about the door. "Fixed it myself," he said too quickly. "Vandals, you know. Kids." But his hands twitched, and Ilara's gut screamed he was hiding something. Community tension was thickening like fog in the hollow. At the market, Mrs. Callie cornered Ilara, her voice low. "You're upsetting folks, digging up pain. Let her babies rest." Ilara's jaw tightened. "They're not dead," she snapped, drawing stares from other shoppers. The words felt like a betrayal of her own doubts, but she clung to them. Back home, she sifted through old news clippings about the Blackthorn case Russo had mentioned, a family's children vanishing a decade ago, their car stalled on a similar road. One detail stood out. A witness had reported a faint smell of oil near the scene, dismissed as irrelevant. Oil again. A pattern or coincidence? That afternoon, a new incident shook Hollow Ridge. A local teenager, Jonah, was found unconscious near the forest's edge, his bike mangled beside a narrow trail. Alara heard the news from a neighbor and rushed to the scene, where deputies cordoned off the area. Jonah's mother, weeping, clutched Alara's arm. "He was just riding home," she sobbed. "Who does this?" Alara's heart sank as she spotted a greasy smudge on Jonah's torn jacket, the same pungent odor she'd come to dread. Russo arrived, his face grim. No witnesses but the kids alive. Concussion, maybe worse. Alara's mind raced. Was this a warning? A distraction? She whispered to Russo, "It's connected. The oil. It's him." Russo pulled her aside, his voice low. "We're looking into locals with mechanical skills. Harlan, maybe others laid off from the mines. Someone with a grudge, maybe against families like yours or Jonah's." Alara remembered her husband's co-workers, men embittered by the mine closures, some who'd glared at her family for staying on their land when others lost everything. One name surfaced, Caleb Morse, a former mechanic who'd worked the mine's equipment. He'd left Hollow Ridge after a public rant about hypocrites hoarding land, his voice thick with resentment. Could he be the one? Alara's pursuit grew reckless. She drove to the library in Blackthorn, digging through public records for Caleb's last known address. The librarian, a kind woman with gray braids, hesitated but pointed her to an old property deed, a derelict cabin near the forest, abandoned after the mine shut down. Alara's pulse quickened. The cabin was close to where her truck had stalled, close to Harlan Station. She called Russo, who cautioned her to wait. "We need warrants, evidence. Don't go alone." But Alara's patience was fraying. She needed to act, to feel closer to Lila and Theo. At dusk, she parked near the cabin's overgrown path, the air heavy with the scent of pine and decay. The structure was a ruin, its windows boarded, but a faint light flickered through a crack. Her heart pounded as she crept closer, her flashlight catching a rusted padlock on the door, recently oiled, gleaming like the brace at Harlan's. A noise inside, a low scrape, sent her retreating to her car, her breath shallow. She called Russo, whispering her location, but before he could respond, her phone buzzed with another unknown number. She answered, and the same distorted voice hissed, "Stop searching, or more will follow." Alara's hands shook as she gripped the wheel, the cabin's light still burning in her mind. How were the crimes linked? And what was hiding in that shadowed ruin? Alara Voss's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, the derelict cabin's flickering light still seared into her mind. The Appalachian night was a shroud, the air heavy with the scent of pine and the metallic tang of fear. That distorted voice on the phone, "Stop searching, or more will follow," echoed like a drumbeat, but it only fueled her. 3 years ago, her children, Lila and Theo, had vanished from her locked truck on a desolate forest road near Hollow Ridge, West Virginia. The greasy envelopes, the oily smudges, the attack on young Jonah, all pointed to a predator lurking in the shadows of this isolated community. Alara's faith, once a lifeline, now felt like a distant echo, drowned out by her primal drive to find her kids. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a hunter, and the cabin was her lead. The next morning, Alara sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a makeshift war room of notes, maps, and old news clippings. The Blackthorn case, children vanishing a decade ago under similar circumstances, nagged at her, its details mirroring her own nightmare. A stalled car, a parent gone briefly, Kids gone without a trace. The oily smell reported back, then matched the stains on the envelopes and Jonah's jacket. She traced a map of the forest, marking the cabin's location near Harlan's gas station and the pull-off where her truck had died. The welded brace on Harlan's door, the oiled padlock on the cabin. Someone with mechanical skill was tying these threads together. Caleb Morse, the embittered ex-mechanic who'd ranted about hypocrites hoarding land, was her prime suspect. His old cabin, a ruin tucked in the woods, was too close to the crime scenes to be coincidence. Alara called Detective Russo, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I saw light in that cabin, Marco. Someone's there." Caleb Morse owned it. Check the deeds. Russo's sigh crackled through the phone. "Alara, we're pulling records, but we need probable cause for a warrant. You can't just storm in. If Caleb's involved, he's dangerous." She heard the weight of his past failure in his voice, the Brooklyn case that still haunted him. "Then help me," she pressed. "Get to those records faster." Russo promised to dig into Caleb's history, his work at the mines, his whereabouts after leaving Hollow Ridge, but urged her to wait. Waiting, though, was a luxury Alara couldn't afford. She drove to the county clerk's office in Blackthorn. A 40-minute trek through winding roads where the gravel's crunch was a grim reminder of her isolation. The clerk, a wiry man with glasses perched on his nose, handed over property records after some coaxing. Caleb Morse had owned the cabin until the mine closures forced him out. It was now listed as abandoned, but a recent utility report showed intermittent power usage. Someone was using it. Alara's pulse raced as she jotted down the details, her mind flashing to the flickering light she'd seen. She also found a mention of Caleb's old job, maintaining heavy equipment at the mines, a role requiring precision with tools and oil. Back in Hollow Ridge, Alara faced mounting resistance. At the church, Pastor Green pulled her aside after Sunday service, his face etched with concern. "You're tearing us apart, Alara. This search, it's defying God's will." The words stung, deepening her internal struggle. Was she betraying her faith by chasing justice? But the memory of Lila's fairy tale book, abandoned in the truck, and Theo's sticky candy bar fingers pushed her forward. She slipped away from the congregation's judgmental stares, her resolve unshaken. Alara's next stop was a risky one. She interviewed Jonah's mother, who was still shaken from the attack on her son. He said he saw someone in the woods, the woman whispered, clutching a tissue. A man tall, with a cap pulled low. He smelled like a garage. Alara's heart thudded. Another clue pointing to a mechanic. She pressed for more, but Jonah's mother shook her head, fear silencing her. The community's code of silence was suffocating, but Alara was done playing by their rules. That evening, she returned to the cabin's outskirts, parking a safe distance away. The forest was a maze of shadows, the air thick with the scent of decay from fallen leaves. Armed with a flashlight and a tire iron from her trunk, she crept closer, her breath shallow. The cabin's boarded windows hid most of its secrets, but the oiled padlock gleamed under her beam. She noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud, leading to a narrow trail. Her heart pounded as she followed them, the path winding deeper into the woods. At its end, she found a rusted shed, its door ajar. Inside, a pile of greasy rags and a toolbox, tools gleaming like the padlock. A faint scratch mark on the floor suggested something heavy had been dragged. Her mind screamed. A trapdoor? A hiding place? She called Russo, whispering her find, but his response was cut off by static. The signal in the hollow was spotty, and Alara's isolation felt absolute. She retreated, her mind racing with moral conflicts. Should she break in now, risking everything, or wait for Russo's slow bureaucracy? The thought of Lila and Theo, possibly alive, tipped the scale. She couldn't wait. But as she turned to leave, headlights flashed through the trees, pinning her in their glare. A truck engine growled, then cut off. Footsteps crunched closer. Alara ducked behind a tree, her tire iron raised, heart hammering. The figure, tall, shadowed, a cap pulled low, paused at the shed, muttering to himself. "No more mistakes," he growled, his voice low but unhinged, laced with bitterness. Was it Caleb? Before she could move, her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up her hiding spot. The figure froze, then turned toward her. She had to face him herself. What was hidden in that shed? Alara Voss's breath hitched as she crouched behind the gnarled oak, the tire iron cold and heavy in her hand. The Appalachian forest was a labyrinth of shadows, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the acrid tang of motor oil that clung to the rusted shed nearby. Her heart pounded like a war drum, each beat echoing the distorted voice from her phone. Stop searching, or more will follow. But she couldn't stop. Not now, not when she was so close. 3 years ago, her children, Lila and Theo, had vanished from her locked truck on a desolate road near Hollow Ridge, West Virginia. The greasy envelopes, the attack on Jonah, the oiled padlock on Kayla Morse's abandoned cabin, all pointed to a predator hiding in plain sight. Alara's faith, once her anchor, was a frayed thread, unraveling against the primal need to find her kids. She was no longer just a mother. She was a force, and the shed's secrets were her target. The figure in the cap, tall, shadowed, muttering bitterly, stood mere feet away, his silhouette framed by the faint glow spilling from the shed's ajar door. Alara's phone buzzed again, its screen betraying her position with a faint light. She silenced it, her pulse racing as the figure's head snapped toward her hiding spot. "Who's there?" he growled, his voice raw with paranoia, confirming her suspicions. Caleb Morse, the ex-mechanic whose resentment had festered since the mine closures. His words from years ago echoed in her mind. Rant about hypocrites hoarding land, his eyes wild at the town meeting before he'd vanished. She tightened her grip on the tire iron, her mind wrestling with fear and resolve. Russo's warning to wait for a warrant was a distant echo. Her children could be inside that shed, alive, or, her heart clenched, not. She edged closer, the crunch of leaves underfoot deafening in the silence. The shed was a corroded shell, its walls pocked with rust, but the toolbox inside gleamed with recent use, and the scratch marks on the floor screamed of something hidden. A trapdoor, a cellar. Alara's flashlight beam danced over the greasy rags, catching a glint of metal beneath them, a small, tarnished locket. Her breath caught. It was Lila's, the one she'd worn that day, engraved with a tiny star. Proof. They'd been here. Her resolve surged, drowning out the self-doubt that had plagued her. Had I locked the truck properly? Had I failed them? No, this was Caleb's doing, and she'd in it tonight. The figure, Caleb, turned back to the shed, oblivious to her presence, and began prying at the floor with a crowbar. A low groan would reveal the trapdoor, its hinges slick with oil. Alara's heart leapt, but before she could act, headlights flared again, closer this time. A second truck rumbled into the clearing, its engine cutting off as another figure emerged. Harlan, the gas station attendant, his squinting eyes unmistakable even in the dark. "You said no more mistakes, Caleb," Harlan hissed, his voice low but sharp. "She's sniffing around. We gotta move them." Alara's blood ran cold. Them. Lila and Theo were alive. Her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. Harlan, with his greasy rags and evasive answers, was no bystander. He was complicit. The welded brace on a station's door, the oil on the envelopes, the busted camera. They'd orchestrated this, preying on stranded families like hers and the Blackthorn victims a decade ago. Caleb's bitterness, fueled by the mine closures that stripped him of purpose, had twisted into something monstrous, and Harlan, with his access to the forest road, was his enabler. But why? Revenge against a community that moved on without them? Alara didn't care. She needed her kids. She crept closer, the tire iron raised, her plan forming. distract them, get to the trapdoor. But Caleb's crowbar clattered, and he spun, his eyes locking onto her shadow. "You!" he roared, lunging with startling speed. Alara swung the tire iron, catching his arm with a sickening crack. He staggered, cursing as Harlan shouted, "Get her!" The forest erupted into chaos. Alara bolted toward the shed, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. She reached the trapdoor, its dark mouth yawning open, and scrambled down the wooden ladder, her hands slick with sweat. The air below was dank, heavy with the stench of mold and something worse. Decay mingled with the faint sweetness of candy, a cruel echo of Theo's sticky fingers. Her flashlight swept over a cramped cellar, a dirt floor, rusted tools, and two small figures huddled in the corner. Lila, her freckled face gaunt but alive, clutched Theo, whose curls were matted with grime. "Mommy," Lila whispered, her voice trembling with trauma and hope. Alara's heart shattered and soared. She rushed to them, tears blurring her vision, but Caleb's footsteps thundered above. "You're too late," he bellowed, descending the ladder, crowbar in hand. Alara shoved Lila and Theo behind a rusted oil drum, her body a shield. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice fierce. Caleb's eyes were wild, his face a mask of rage and desperation. "You don't understand," he spat. "They took everything, my job, my home. You all kept your land, your lives, while I got nothing." His words confirmed her suspicions. A man broken by exclusion, lashing out at those who symbolized his loss. But Alara saw the humanity in his unraveling. His hands shook, his voice cracked. He wasn't a monster, just a man consumed by resentment. The cellar was a trap, but Alara used the environment. She kicked over the oil drum, its contents spilling across the dirt, slicking the floor. Caleb slipped, his crowbar swinging wide, and Alara tackled him, her tire iron clanging against his weapon. The fight was brutal, her strength born of a mother's desperation. Lila's scream pierced the air as Alara pinned Caleb, her knee on his chest. "Where's Harlan?" she demanded, but a creak above answered her. Harlan, fleeing. She tied Caleb's wrists with a rope from the toolbox, her hands shaking but sure, and pulled her children close. Lila sobbed, her trauma raw, while Theo clung silently, his eyes wide with fear. They climbed the ladder, emerging into the night as Harlan's truck roared away. Alara's phone had no signal, but she knew Russo was on his way. He promised to check the cabin after her call. Headlights flashed in the distance, and she prayed it was him. She led Lila and Theo through the woods, their small hands in hers, the forest silence no longer mocking but protective. They were free, but Caleb's words lingered. "You don't understand." Justice awaited. Harlan was still out there, and Caleb's motives ran deeper than she'd grasped. Would he face what he'd done? The Appalachian dawn broke over Hollow Ridge, its pale light filtering through the pines, casting long shadows across Alara Voss's weathered farmhouse. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint, lingering bitterness of motor oil, a reminder of the nightmare she'd just escaped. 3 years ago, her children, Lila and Theo, had been stolen from her locked truck on a desolate forest road, a wound that had torn at her faith and fueled her relentless pursuit. Now, they were home, curled under blankets in the living room, their faces pale and haunted but alive. Alara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, its warmth grounding her as she wrestled with the aftermath. Caleb Morse was in custody, his confession spilling like the oil he'd used to mark his crimes. But Harlan, his accomplice, remained a ghost in the hills. Justice was close, but the scars of trauma and community betrayal lingered, as did Alara's struggle to reconcile her shattered faith with the resilience that had carried her through. The night of the rescue replayed in her mind like a fever dream. After tying Caleb in the cellar, Alara had led Lila and Theo through the forest, their small hands trembling in hers. Detective Marco Russo's headlights had pierced the darkness just in time, his cruiser skidding into the clearing as Harlan's truck vanished into the night. Russo had taken Caleb into custody, the ex-mechanic's ranting confession revealing a twisted motive: resentment over the mine closures that had stripped him of his livelihood, targeting families like Alara's who'd clung to their land while he'd lost everything. "You all moved on," he'd spat, his eyes wild. "Left us to rot." Lila and Theo, kept in the cellar to punish the community, had survived on meager rations, their spirits battered but unbroken. Alara's heart ached at Lila's whispered stories of captivity, darkness, cold, and Caleb's muttered apologies, and Theo's silent clinging, his once bright eyes dulled by fear. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews and community upheaval. Russo's team combed the cabin and shed, uncovering evidence that tied Caleb to the Blackthorn case a decade ago: a hidden stash of children's toys, oil-stained clothing, and a ledger detailing his and Harlan's movements. The greasy envelopes, the attack on Jonah, all were part of Caleb's vendetta, with Harlan enabling him, using his gas station as a lookout to prey on stranded travelers. Harlan's whereabouts remained unknown, his truck found abandoned near the state line, but Russo assured Alara they'd find him. "He can't hide forever," he said, his Brooklyn accent thick with determination, his own redemption tied to closing this case. Hollow Ridge, however, was slower to heal. The community, bound by faith and tradition, recoiled from the truth. At the church, Pastor Green offered a sermon on forgiveness, but his words felt hollow to Alara. The congregation's whispers, once accusing her of negligence, now carried guilt for their silence. Mrs. Callie, whose son had left the town in bitterness, approached Alara at the potluck, her eyes red. "We should have listened," she murmured. "We failed you." Alara nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to forgive, to mend the rift, but the isolation of their judgment still stung. Her faith, tested to its breaking point, flickered like a candle in the wind. God had spared her children, but why had he allowed their suffering? She found no answers, only the quiet strength of her own defiance. Lila and Theo's recovery was a slow, fragile process. Lila, once vibrant, spoke in halting sentences, her trauma surfacing in nightmares about the cellar's darkness. Theo, barely verbal, clung to Alara's side, his small hands gripping her like a lifeline. A therapist from Blackthorn, recommended by Russo, began visiting, guiding them through exercises to process their ordeal. Alara joined them, her own guilt and self-doubt laid bare. "I should have stayed with you," she whispered to Lila one night, stroking her daughter's hair. Lila's reply, soft but firm, cut deep. "You came for us, Mommy. That's enough." The words were a balm, stitching together Alara's fractured heart. The trial loomed, a beacon of justice in the fog of pain. Caleb's arraignment revealed more. His obsession with teaching the community had roots in his own childhood rejection, a foster kid shunned by Hollow Ridge's tight-knit families. The ledger detailed his plans, including targeting Jonah to scare Alara off. Evidence from the shed, Lila's locket, Theo's candy wrappers, sealed his fate. Alara sat in the courtroom, her hands steady as she faced him, his wild eyes meeting hers with a mix of defiance and shame. "I didn't want to hurt them," he muttered, but the judge's gavel silenced him. A guilty plea was expected, but Harlan's absence gnawed at Alara, a loose thread in the tapestry of closure. Back home, Alara found solace in small acts of healing. She and Lila began quilting, a tradition from her own mother, each stitch a step toward recovery. The quilt, patterned with stars like Lila's locket, became a symbol of their resilience, a tangible defiance against the shadows. Theo watched, his silence softening as he handed them scraps of fabric, a quiet sign of trust returning. The community, too, took tentative steps. a fundraiser for therapy costs, a vigil for the Blackthorn victims, and whispered apologies of the market. Alara accepted them, not out of forgiveness but necessity. Hollow Ridge was her home, flawed but hers. As winter crept into the valley, Alara stood on her porch, watching Lila and Theo play in the yard, their laughter fragile but real. The forest loomed beyond, its silence no longer mocking but heavy with lessons. Justice was near. Russo called daily with updates on Harlan's manhunt, but the scars remained. Alara's faith, though battered, began to mend, not in divine plans, but in the human capacity to endure. She clutched the quilt, its stitches a testament to their survival. "We heal one stitch at a time," she murmured, her eyes on her children, "but the shadows remain."